Commander Markus Hale, the alien said, inclining its narrow head. We welcome you to the Galactic Council. I am Zoriktal, your escort. Markus inclined his head in return. An honor, Zoriktal, though I imagine some might not share your sentiment. The alien's mandibles twitched, a gesture Markus couldn't interpret but found unsettling. Your reputation precedes you, Commander. Good, Markus replied evenly. It saves time. As the group moved deeper into the station, the environment shifted. The corridors became narrower, more confining, and the walls emitted a dim bioluminescent glow, casting elongated shadows. The temperature dropped further, and the floor beneath their feet vibrated faintly, as if the station itself was alive. Markus noted every detail. The flickering lights, the subtle shifts in atmosphere, the way some aliens kept their distance while others whispered in languages he couldn't understand. Inside the council chamber, the atmosphere was oppressive. Rows of tiered seats curved around the room in a semicircle, filled with alien delegates. The ceiling stretched high, adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, a disorienting trick of alien artistry. The air smelled faintly of sulfur, not enough to sting, but enough to remind Markus that he was far from home. A holographic projection of the galaxy rotated in the center of the chamber, its luminous lines outlining territories and borders. At its edge, an ominous red bloom marked the spread of the Krath'vok Swarm, a silent predator creeping ever closer. One of the delegates, a creature resembling a mass of shifting, translucent tendrils, spoke. Its voice was soft but layered, as if several beings spoke in unison. Your kind, it began, its tendrils undulating with each syllable, has brought unpredictability, chaos. Can you truly comprehend the gravity of the threat we face? Markus stepped forward, his boots striking the polished floor with a deliberate cadence. His voice, cold and precise, cut through the alien's layered tones like a scalpel. Chaos is what we've survived for millennia, he said. Your kind fears it. We mastered it. The room fell silent, the projection of the galaxy spinning lazily above them. A crystalline alien with sharp, angular features leaned forward, its voice resonant and accusatory. You laugh at destruction. You mock fear. How can such recklessness serve the Council? Markus allowed himself a small, calculated smile. Laughter doesn't mean we don't understand fear. It means we refuse to be controlled by it. And that, Counselor, is why we're here. Zoriktal, standing to Markus's side, made a sound that could have been approval or exasperation. Perhaps we should allow the commander to present his perspective. Markus stepped closer to the holographic projection, the light casting sharp shadows across his face. He extended a hand, tapping the red bloom marking the Krath'vok territory. It expanded, showing a swarm of moving red dots that encroached on coalition space. You see this, he said, addressing the room, and you think it's unstoppable. You see precision, numbers, coordination. But what I see is a weakness, a hive mind reliant on predictability. He let the words sink in, his voice growing quieter, more dangerous. And we're going to show them something they've never seen before. The silence that followed was palpable, thick with uncertainty and unspoken fear. Markus turned his gaze to the assembly, his tone sharp as steel. You brought Deathworlders into your council, he said. Now it's time to find out if you made the right choice. Somewhere in the room, a faint clicking sound echoed, a nervous gesture from an alien delegate. It was the only sound as Markus stepped back, his expression a mask of grim resolve. The council had asked for humanity's help. Markus was here to deliver it, but not in the way they expected. The council chamber's oppressive silence clung to Markus Hale like a second skin as he stepped back into the shadowy corner of the room. He stood rigid, his face impassive, yet every nerve in his body remained on high alert. The council's reaction, or lack of one, gnawed at him. They didn't believe him, not entirely. Markus let his gaze wander over the alien delegates, their postures betraying a spectrum of emotions, the crystalline ambassador's faint but rhythmic pulsing, an unconscious gesture of distrust, the insectoid counselor who fidgeted with its segmented limbs, clicking softly against the floor as if trying to find balance. Every detail etched itself into his mind, catalogued as potential leverage. They think we're reckless, dangerous, unpredictable, he thought, suppressing a bitter smile. They're right. And that's the only chance they've got. Zorektal escorted Markus and Voss from the chamber, their steps echoing along the polished corridors. The walls glistened faintly, emitting a cool blue light that pulsed irregularly, like the station itself was uneasy. Markus noted how the lighting dimmed slightly as Zorektal's black, segmented fingers grazed a nearby panel, a subtle but deliberate touch. The alien's narrow head tilted toward Markus, its angular features catching the light in sharp relief. "Your words unsettle them, Commander," Zorektal said, its voice precise and sharp-edged, as if each syllable were meant to test him. "You speak of chaos as though it's a weapon. Many here see it as a plague." Markus's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's both," he said simply, "but a weapon in the right hands is what wins wars." Zorektal's mandibles twitched faintly. "And in the wrong hands?" Markus slowed his pace, his boots striking the floor deliberately now. He stopped and turned to face Zorektal, meeting the alien's unreadable gaze. "Then it wins the wrong war." The air between them felt charged, and Markus caught Voss shifting uncomfortably in his peripheral vision. The lieutenant had remained silent since leaving the chamber, but Markus could feel the questions simmering beneath his practiced calm. Voss wasn't the kind to voice doubts, not until they boiled over. Zorektal inclined its head, the movement unsettlingly fluid. "Perhaps chaos suits your kind too well," it murmured before turning and continuing down the corridor. Once they were alone in the docking bay, Voss finally let the tension crack. "Chaos as a weapon?" he said, his tone half joking, half accusatory. "You're not exactly making friends out there, Markus." Markus's gaze lingered on the docking clamps locking the Aegis Valor to the alien station. The sleek lines of the ship's hull looked almost crude next to the crystalline elegance of the station. But to Markus, it felt like home, a reminder of what Earth had built out of necessity, not luxury. "I'm not here to make friends," Markus said at last, his tone clipped. "I'm here to make sure they survive long enough to regret calling us." "Sure," Voss replied, leaning back against a bulkhead, his posture casual but his voice low. "But the way you're going, they might think we're the bigger threat." Markus turned to him, his gray eyes sharp as a blade's edge. "Let them. Fear is leverage. Distrust can be shaped. But complacency? That's a death sentence." Voss hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. He'd followed Markus through enough campaigns to know better than to second-guess him. But the Alien Council was a different kind of battlefield, one without clear rules of engagement. The hiss of the bay doors opening drew their attention. A figure stepped into the space, humanoid but unmistakably alien. Its tall, slender form was encased in a suit of intricate, overlapping plates that glimmered faintly like liquid metal. The newcomer's voice, low and resonant, filled the docking bay. "Commander Hale." It spoke his name with the precision of someone testing the weight of a blade. "Your presence has not gone unnoticed." Markus's gaze flicked to the figure who walked with an unnerving grace, its every step deliberate, measured. "That was the idea," Markus replied, his tone flat. "Who are you?" "I am Viren," it said, its voice carrying an undercurrent of something unspoken. "I represent those who believe your methods warrant consideration." Markus stepped forward, his boots striking the floor like hammer blows. "Consideration? That's a polite way of saying you're not sure whether to trust me or airlock me." Viren tilted its head, its smooth, metallic features catching the pale light. "Trust is earned, Commander, and your kind's history is, colorful." Markus let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. Colorful doesn't win wars. No, Viren agreed, stepping closer. But neither does recklessness. You claim to see the swarm's weakness. I am not convinced your vision isn't clouded by your species' peculiar instincts. Peculiar instincts, Markus repeated, the words rolling off his tongue with quiet derision. That's a poetic way of saying, you think we're insane. Viren's gaze remained unflinching. Are you not? Markus's mouth twitched, an almost imperceptible movement. He stepped even closer, closing the distance between them until Viren's reflective surface mirrored his own image back at him. What you call insanity, we call survival. The tension hung heavy between them, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Viren inclined its head slightly, almost a bow. Perhaps we will see if your survival instincts translate to victory. Without another word, Viren turned and left, its footsteps silent as it disappeared into the shadows of the corridor. Charming, Voss muttered once the alien was gone. That one's definitely not inviting us to dinner. Markus exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. They're scared. They don't know whether to fear us more than the swarm. That makes them predictable. Voss raised an eyebrow. Predictable how? Markus didn't answer immediately. He turned back to the Aegis Valor, his gaze tracing the ship's angular silhouette as if it held all the answers he needed. Finally, he said, fear forces choices. When the swarm comes, they'll look to us. And when they do, we'll make sure the swarm sees something they've never faced before. The sound of Voss's boots scraping faintly against the metal floor was the only reply for several moments. Then, in a tone that was equal parts admiration and unease, he said, you really think this plan of yours is going to work? Markus's eyes didn't waver from the ship. It's not about whether it works, he said softly. It's about making them believe it will. The docking bay lights dimmed slightly as if the station was reacting to an unseen shift in the air. Markus turned, his posture rigid but his expression unreadable. Get the team ready. I want full scans of Coalition fleet movements and a breakdown of their communication protocols. Voss hesitated, then nodded, his features settling into the grim determination that had carried them through a dozen impossible missions. Understood. And what about you? Markus's gray eyes glinted with something unreadable. I'm going to remind them why Earth doesn't just survive chaos. We thrive in it. Voss left, his footsteps fading into the docking bay's cavernous expanse. Markus remained behind, staring into the cold void of space, his mind already racing through 1,000 contingencies. Somewhere out there, the swarm was moving closer. And somewhere closer still, the seeds of doubt were beginning to take root. Markus would let them grow. For now. The galaxy's edge had always felt vast and distant, but now it loomed, a suffocating reminder of fragility. Markus Hale studied the projected map of the Krath'vok's advance, his sharp gaze fixed on the blood-red threads spidering across Coalition space. Each crimson tendril marked a system consumed, planets stripped bare, fleets obliterated. The swarm's march was precise, merciless, a cold mathematical certainty. The war room aboard the Aegis Valor pulsed with muted tension. The holographic display cast fractured light against the dark metallic walls, illuminating faces strained by unseen weight. Technicians whispered hurriedly, their fingers darting across glowing consoles. Markus, standing at the center of this hive of activity, remained still, his expression carved from stone. "Commander," said Voss from Markus's right, his voice low but edged with urgency. "We've received another distress signal. Outer colony, Velos 4. They're asking for reinforcements." Markus didn't shift his gaze from the hologram. His mind churned beneath the surface, weaving threads of possibility. "When did it come in?" 40 minutes ago. By the time the Coalition fleet arrives." Voss trailed off, his meaning clear. Markus's lips thinned. Velos 4 wasn't the objective. It was bait, a desperate, flailing gesture to divert resources and bleed the Coalition dry. The swarm wasn't just fighting a war. It was dismantling morale, carving fear into the heart of every decision. Markus. Voss leaned in, his tone sharper now. We can't ignore them. We're not, Markus replied, finally turning his steely gaze toward his second-in-command. But we're not falling into their trap either. Voss's jaw tightened. And what happens when they do this again and again? If we sit back, we lose the war before it starts. Markus cut him off, his voice carrying the weight of iron. The swarm doesn't break fleets, it breaks willpower. Every desperate move they force us to make is another inch closer to collapse. He stepped forward, his boots striking the floor with deliberate precision, and gestured toward the map. We think like them, Voss. Cold, calculated. We let Velos 4 fall to secure the next 10 systems. The words hung in the air like a blade poised to drop. Voss's frustration flickered across his features, but he said nothing, the fight draining from him as logic overtook emotion. He knew Markus was right, even if it tasted bitter. A sharp chime broke the silence, drawing every eye to the room's main console. A holographic image flickered to life, revealing a figure cloaked in shadow. The faint glow of its eyes betrayed its identity, Viren. Commander Hale, Viren said, its voice resonating through the room like the distant echo of breaking glass. The council grows restless. They question your restraint. Markus folded his arms, his posture unwavering. They question because they don't understand. Perhaps they would understand better, Viren continued, if you shared your intentions. Markus's eyes narrowed. And lose the only advantage we have? Number the alien tilted its head, the motion almost serpentine. You gamble much on secrets, human. Markus leaned closer to the hologram, his voice dropping to a low growl. You think we're playing the same game, Viren, but the swarm isn't interested in your rules. They're rewriting the board. Viren's glowing eyes flickered, but its response was cut short by another alert. A new holographic display materialized beside it, a grainy, static-laced feed from Velos 4. The image showed the planet's surface, once teeming with life, now cloaked in dark ash. Shadows moved through the chaos, vast and many-limbed. The sound, an unnatural, skittering cacophony, sent a chill through the room. Voss cursed under his breath. They're already there. Markus studied the feed, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the scene. The Krath'vok moved with terrifying precision, their blackened forms coiling and striking like living storms. The colony's defenses were crumbling, desperate firepower splashing harmlessly against their sleek exoskeletons. Commander, one of the technicians murmured, his voice trembling. The feed. It's live. Markus nodded curtly. Keep it up. Let the coalition see what happens when they hesitate. The room fell silent as they watched. The screen showed the colony's last moments, fire roaring through steel corridors, survivors fleeing into tunnels as the swarm advanced relentlessly. There was no victory here, only survival bought in minutes. Markus broke the silence. End the transmission. But sir, end it. The feed cut off, plunging the room into a heavy quiet. Markus turned away, his movements sharp as he approached the far console. He leaned over it, his hands gripping the edges as though grounding himself. They'll push harder now, he said, his voice low but steady. Every step forward will be a feint, every weakness bait. We don't react. We make them react. And how do we do that? Voss asked, his tone tight. Markus straightened, his expression unreadable. By showing them what they've never faced before. What does that even mean? Voss demanded, the frustration breaking through his control. We can't keep stringing the council along with riddles. They're already losing faith. They don't need faith, Markus snapped, his voice cutting like steel against stone. They need results. Viren's image flickered again, its voice colder now. Results are measured in lives, Commander, not abstractions. Markus turned to face the hologram, his gaze piercing. If you want results, then you let me lead. No more interference, no more doubts. The alien was silent for a long moment, its glowing eyes studying him. Finally, it inclined its head slightly. You have until the next council meeting, Commander. After that, I can make no promises. The transmission ended, leaving Markus and his team alone in the tense electric stillness. Voss, Markus said, his tone brokering no argument, get the crew ready. We need a complete diagnostic on every coalition ship within 5 systems. Focus on communication weaknesses, anything exploitable. Voss hesitated, his shoulders tense. And what about the council? Markus's gaze was hard as granite. Let me worry about the council. You worry about making sure we're ready when the swarm turns its eyes on us. The lieutenant gave a curt nod, then turned on his heel and left the room, his steps quick but purposeful. The war room emptied slowly, one technician after another filtering out until Markus stood alone, the holographic galaxy still spinning before him. His thoughts raced, weaving threads of strategy, doubt, and inevitability. The swarm was moving faster than anticipated, its tactics shifting with unsettling intelligence. But beneath the cold logic of their advance, Markus saw something else. A pattern, subtle but there. The Krath'vok weren't just attacking. They were watching, learning, testing. Markus's hand clenched into a fist as he stared at the red tendrils creeping across the map. If they're testing us, he murmured to himself, his voice low and edged with steel, then it's time they learned what happens when you push humanity too far. The lights dimmed slightly, casting long shadows across the room. Somewhere deep within the station, a faint vibration pulsed through the structure, barely perceptible but constant. Markus didn't move, his gray eyes fixed on the map as though willing it to bend to his will. The swarm had drawn first blood. Now, it was humanity's turn to show them what war truly looked like. The war room was silent, its occupants suspended in a fragile tension that could shatter with a word. Markus Hale stood at the center, arms crossed, his sharp gaze fixed on the holographic display of coalition forces. The galaxy's dark expanse glittered faintly, its stars cold and indifferent to the violence creeping across it. Behind him, Lieutenant Voss approached, his boots scuffing softly against the steel floor. Fleet positions are updated, Voss said, his voice carefully measured. 3 destroyers, 2 frigates, and the coalition flagship will rendezvous at Elar Prime in 6 hours. They're sending their best. Markus didn't turn. His focus lingered on the data scrolling before him, lines of statistics glowing pale blue against the dim light of the room. Their best isn't good enough, he replied. The words weren't a rebuke, but they carried a finality that left no room for debate. Voss hesitated. You don't think we can hold them there? Markus's eyes flicked to him, cool and calculating. Holding isn't the point. Voss frowned but didn't press further. He had seen that look before, the hard glint of a man thinking several moves ahead, each one designed to tighten a noose around the enemy's throat. Send the deployment orders, Markus said, his tone curt. And make sure the orbital drones are synced to our network. If this works, we'll need precision. As Voss moved to carry out the instructions, Markus turned his attention back to the display. Elar Prime wasn't just another colony. It was a strategic choke point, its orbital defenses a faint but defiant line against the swarm's advance. The Krath'vok would strike hard and fast, overwhelming the coalition with sheer numbers. That was their strength, and their weakness. The door hissed open, and Markus glanced up as Zoric entered. The alien's black segmented armor reflected the dim light, its movements fluid and deliberate. The air seemed to grow colder as it stepped into the room, the faint scent of something sharp and antiseptic trailing behind it. You summoned me, Commander, Zoric said, its voice a low, cutting cadence that demanded attention. Markus nodded. I need confirmation. The Krath'vok's hive-mind, does it adapt through observation or direct contact? Zorictal's angular head tilted slightly, its glowing eyes narrowing. Both. The hive mind absorbs patterns, refines them into strategies. Why? Markus straightened, his expression hard. Because we're about to feed it something it can't process. The alien's mandibles clicked faintly, a sound that might have been skepticism. You intend to mislead it? I intend to blind it, Markus said. The swarm relies on coordination. Without it, they're just fragments, pieces without a whole. Zorik studied him for a long moment, then inclined its head. A dangerous gamble. Markus's jaw tightened. So is waiting. Hours later, the fleet emerged from the void, their hulls gleaming faintly against the cold light of Eltar Prime's twin moons. The planet below was a stark expanse of jagged terrain and silvery plains, its surface dotted with faint patches of green. Orbital platforms hovered in precise formation, their weapons primed but almost pitiful compared to the wave of red markers swelling across the holographic map. On the Aegis Valor's bridge, Markus stood at the command console, his presence a grounding force amid the chaos. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, their voices low but steady as they relayed updates. The tension in the air was palpable, a coiled wire ready to snap. They're in range, a tactical officer reported, his hands flying over the console. Krath'vok ships detected. Count is climbing. Over 100 vessels, maybe more. Deploy decoys, Markus ordered. Full spread. Make them chase ghosts. The officer nodded, and seconds later, the display lit up with scattered markers, false signals designed to fracture the swarm's formation. The Krath'vok ships, sleek and predatory, surged forward, their movements almost serpentine as they began to adjust. They're tracking the decoys, Voss said, a note of unease creeping into his voice. But they're adapting fast. They'll adapt faster when we hit them, Markus said coldly. Bring the orbital platforms online. Focus fire on their flanks. The room shifted into controlled chaos as commands were relayed. Outside, the darkness of space ignited with flashes of light as the platforms unleashed volleys of energy. The Krath'vok swarmed like a black tide, their ships weaving through the barrage with unnerving precision. Still, the coalition forces held, their coordinated fire creating brief pockets of chaos within the enemy's ranks. On the bridge, Markus's voice was sharp, cutting through the noise. Rotate formation, keep them guessing. If they predict your next move, you've already lost. The coalition fleet moved as one, their ships arcing and shifting in ways that defied standard tactics. It wasn't elegance, it was survival, a chaotic dance that forced the swarm to react rather than dictate. But the Krath'vok weren't so easily undone. They're breaking through the outer line, a voice called out. The display showed the swarm's ships clustering together, their movements growing more synchronized as they pushed toward the planet's surface. Prepare the drones, Markus said, his tone as calm as it was deadly. Activate the disruption net. A beat passed. Then another. And then the station's sensors registered a new signal, a wave of electromagnetic interference that swept across the battlefield. The swarm's coordination faltered. Their ships shuddered mid-flight, their formations breaking apart like shattered glass. They're vulnerable, Voss said, his voice tinged with disbelief. We've actually stalled them. Markus's gaze didn't waver. For now. The Krath'vok ships began to regroup, their movements erratic but still dangerous. The swarm was learning, adapting to the disruption. Markus's jaw tightened as he watched their fractured unity start to coalesce once more. They'll recalibrate, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, but not before we make our move. What move? Voss asked, his eyes narrowing. We've got them on the ropes. Shouldn't we press? Markus turned to him, his expression unreadable. Not yet. The lieutenant's frustration was evident, but he didn't argue. Instead, he focused on relaying the next set of orders, his voice steady despite the chaos. As the battle raged outside, Markus felt the weight of each decision pressing against him. Every move, every hesitation carried a cost. And somewhere in the shadows of the battlefield, the Krath'vok hive mind was watching, learning. They weren't just fighting a war. They were playing a game of perception, of manipulation, and Markus was determined to show them what humanity could do when the rules no longer applied. He turned his attention back to the display, his eyes narrowing as he studied the shifting patterns of the swarm's movements. They weren't just adapting, they were testing him, probing for weaknesses. Good, Markus thought grimly. Let them try. The final phase of his plan was already in motion, its threads weaving through the chaos like unseen hands guiding the battlefield. But the swarm didn't know that yet. For now, all they saw was a fractured fleet, a desperate defense. They had no idea what was coming next. The void outside the Aegis Valor churned with chaos. The coalition fleet, battered but unyielding, danced through the swarm's relentless tide. Markus Hale stood at the bridge's center, his sharp gaze fixed on the shifting patterns of the Krath'vok ships. The holographic display cast fractured light across his face, sharpening the lines of tension carved into his features. "Status?" Markus asked, his voice a blade cutting through the noise. "Shields at 63%, replied a technician, their hands darting over glowing controls. "Drone net holding for now, but they're probing the edges. It won't last long." Markus's jaw tightened. He could feel the room trembling, not from any physical impact, but from the collective weight of fear and resolve. The air carried the faint tang of overheated circuits, mingling with the muted thrum of distant alarms. Every breath tasted dry, metallic, as if the very ship exhaled its own exhaustion. "They're not breaking yet," Voss said, stepping beside Markus. His tone was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "But they're adapting faster than we can counter." Markus didn't respond immediately. His mind churned, threading possibilities together in a lattice of contingencies. Each choice carried a cost. The trick was making sure it was one the swarm paid first. "They're testing us," Markus said at last, his voice low but firm. "Every maneuver, every reaction, we're teaching them." "So what do we do?" Voss asked, his frustration crackling beneath the surface. "Stop playing defense?" Markus turned to him, his gray eyes gleaming like storm clouds before a downpour. "We show them what happens when humans stop playing entirely." The room stilled, the crew instinctively leaning into Markus's words like sailors awaiting the shift of the tide. He didn't elaborate. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements sharp and deliberate, and pointed to a cluster of ships on the holographic map. "Redirect the orbital platforms to these coordinates," he ordered. "Focus all firepower here." One of the officers hesitated, their voice tinged with uncertainty. "Sir, that's a blind spot. If we pull resources there—" "The swarm won't expect it," Markus interjected, his tone carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "It's not a blind spot, it's bait." The officer nodded, their hesitation melting into resolve. Commands rippled through the bridge and the map began to shift, the coalition's forces pivoting toward the new position. Outside, the darkness of space ignited once more, the orbital platforms unleashing volleys of energy that lit the void in bursts of blue and gold. But the Krath'vok were ready. "They're countering!" Voss called out, his voice rising. The swarm's ships swarmed toward the baited sector, their movements sharper, more coordinated. "They're adapting again, it's like they knew." "They're learning faster," Markus said, his gaze hardening. "Faster than we expected." A cold realization crept over him. The Krath'vok weren't just reacting, they were anticipating. The hive-mind wasn't merely adapting, it was evolving, turning every move against its enemy with a precision that bordered on sentient malice. "They're pushing through the outer line," a tactical officer shouted, their voice cracking under the strain. "Pull back the second wave," Markus commanded. "Collapse the formation, force them into the center." The bridge was a flurry of activity as the orders were relayed. Outside, the coalition ships shifted, their maneuvers tightening into a defensive cluster. The swarm followed, their sleek, shadowy vessels converging like vultures over carrion. Markus's plan unfolded in brutal clarity. The Krath'vok were drawn inward, their formation tightening as they chased the apparent vulnerability, and then the trap closed. "Activate the disruption array," Markus ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. A sudden surge of electromagnetic energy swept through the battlefield, a pulse so powerful it warped the light around it. The swarm ships faltered mid-flight, their movements jerking and stuttering like marionettes with tangled strings. For a moment, the battlefield stilled, the silence oppressive, electric. "They're breaking formation!" Voss exclaimed, his tone laced with a rare note of awe. But Markus wasn't smiling. He watched as the Krath'vok ships began to recover, their movements regaining fluidity with unnerving speed. The disruption had bought them moments that were already slipping through their fingers. "They're not breaking," Markus said quietly. "They're recalibrating." His words hung heavy in the air, a truth too sharp to ignore. The Krath'vok weren't just enduring the disruption, they were absorbing it, weaving it into their hive-mind with terrifying efficiency. "Sir," one of the technicians said, their voice trembling, "we're detecting fluctuations. It's like they're mimicking the disruption pulse." Markus's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer to the console, his gaze flicking across the data. The swarm's ships were shifting again, their patterns erratic, chaotic, unnervingly human. "They're testing us," he muttered, "learning how to use our chaos against us." A sudden, violent tremor shook the Aegis Valor, the impact reverberating through its frame like a guttural roar. Sparks rained from a nearby console, the acrid tang of scorched metal searing the air. "Report," Markus barked. "Direct hit to the starboard shields," an officer called out, their voice strained. "They're targeting the core systems. Precision strikes." "Of course they are," Markus muttered, his jaw clenched. He turned to Voss. "Get me targeting solutions. We can't let them regroup." But before Voss could respond, another tremor rocked the ship, this one more violent than the last. The bridge lights flickered, plunging the room into brief, disorienting darkness. When they returned, the tension had thickened, the air heavy with the taste of sweat and fear. "They're breaching the perimeter," a voice shouted. "Multiple ships inbound, close range." Markus felt the weight of the moment pressing against him like a vice. Every decision, every second, mattered now. The swarm wasn't just pressing, they were driving toward something, a purpose Markus couldn't yet see. "Redirect all firepower to the nearest targets," he ordered, his voice a steady anchor amid the storm. "Keep them off the main fleet." The crew moved with practiced precision, their fear channeled into action. Outside, the coalition's ships unleashed a withering barrage, their weapons lighting the void with bursts of brilliant energy. The swarm retaliated with equal ferocity, their ships slicing through the battlefield like serrated knives. And still, Markus felt it, the creeping sense that they were missing something, that the Krath'vok were playing a deeper game. His thoughts raced, threading possibilities together, searching for the pattern beneath the chaos. "They're moving toward the planet," Voss said suddenly, his tone sharp with realization. "Eltar Prime. They're not just attacking the fleet. They're targeting the surface." Markus's eyes snapped to the map. The swarm's ships were converging, their movements tightening into a spearhead aimed directly at the planet's vulnerable colonies. "They're not breaking us," Markus murmured. "They're bypassing us." The truth struck him like a hammer. The Krath'vok didn't need to destroy the coalition fleet. They only needed to outmaneuver it. And unless Markus acted fast, the battle for Eltar Prime would become a massacre. "Get me a direct link to the orbital defenses," Markus said, his voice cold and razor-sharp. "We're going to stop them. Here, now." The bridge erupted into motion as the orders were relayed. Markus stepped back, his mind racing, his heart pounding with a grim determination. The swarm thought they had the advantage. They thought they had learned humanity's patterns. But Markus Hale wasn't about to let them write the next chapter of this war, not without showing them what true chaos looked like. The bridge of the Aegis Valor crackled with urgency as commands flew between consoles, sharp and unrelenting. The faint vibrations coursing through the ship were not merely physical. They carried the tension of a fleet walking the razor-thin edge between victory and annihilation. The distant flashes of battle reflected on Markus Hale's impassive face, their violent brilliance painting fleeting shadows that deepened his resolve. "Orbital defenses online," a tactical officer called, his voice clipped. Weapons primed and locked on advancing targets. Markus's gray eyes narrowed as he surveyed the tactical display. The Krath'vok spearhead was closing in on Eltar Prime's atmosphere. A precision strike aimed not just at victory but at total devastation. Their ships moved like predators, fluid and deliberate, their organic hulls rippling with an unnerving light that seemed to pulse with life. "They're not just aiming for the colonies," Markus said, his voice low but cutting. "They're aiming to leave nothing behind." Voss stepped closer, his expression tight with barely contained frustration. "We can't intercept fast enough. Even with the drones, they'll break through the defensive line." Markus didn't flinch. His focus stayed locked on the display, his mind a storm of calculations and contingencies. "They think they're winning. That's their mistake." Voss glanced at him, his brows furrowing. "You've got something, don't you?" Markus tilted his head slightly, the faintest hint of a grim smile ghosting across his lips. "They want to learn from us? Let's give them a lesson they'll never forget." He turned sharply, his boots striking the steel floor with deliberate force. "Activate Protocol Theta. Prepare the decoy fleet." Voss's eyes widened. "Protocol Theta? That's still experimental, untested." Markus didn't hesitate. "So is this war." Minutes later, the Aegis Valor led a calculated retreat, its sleek frame gliding with predatory grace as it moved to draw the Krath'vok into a deeper pursuit. The main coalition fleet shifted behind it, breaking into scattered formations designed to appear chaotic, yet purposeful. The illusion was masterful, an enemy on the brink of collapse, scrambling for survival. The swarm fell for it. "They're closing in," a sensor technician reported, sweat beading along his temple. "They're accelerating toward the decoy positions." Markus's gaze remained fixed on the display, his focus unyielding. "Let them. They think they've won." The decoy fleet, a collection of automated vessels outfitted with enhanced signal emitters, powered to life. Each ship was a phantom, a mirage of false heat signatures and electromagnetic noise designed to mimic the presence of a real fleet. From a distance, they appeared tangible, vulnerable, a perfect target. The Krath'vok surged forward, their spearhead breaking apart as individual ships peeled off to chase the decoys, their formation fractured, their fluid precision unraveling into isolated hunts. The hive-mind strategy faltered, its coordination spread too thin. "They're biting," Voss said, a flicker of disbelief in his tone. "They're actually going for it." Markus's expression remained hard, his voice colder than the void. "They don't know it yet, but they've already lost." The first decoy ships detonated. The explosions weren't conventional. They were calculated bursts of electromagnetic interference, laced with sonic pulses that reverberated through the Krath'vok's organic hulls. The swarm faltered, their ships convulsing mid-flight as their systems scrambled to recalibrate. What should have been seamless recovery turned into chaos, a testament to the hive-mind's Achilles heel. "They're destabilizing," a communications officer said, his voice tinged with awe. "It's working." Markus allowed himself a brief nod. "Now we press." The Aegis Valor surged forward, its weapons igniting the void in a brilliant cascade of energy. The coalition fleet followed suit, their firepower converging on the fractured Krath'vok ships with surgical precision. The swarm's once imposing formation was now a patchwork of desperation, their attempts to regroup stifled by the relentless assault. But Markus wasn't done. "Deploy the sonic destabilizers," he ordered, his voice as sharp as the strategy he'd crafted. "Full spread." A ripple of energy burst outward, carrying with it a sound, a low, reverberating tone that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of one's bones. It wasn't merely sound. It was a weapon, engineered to exploit the Krath'vok's heightened sensory structures. Their ship spasmed, their movements growing erratic as the hive-mind struggled to compensate. "They're panicking," Voss said, the faintest hint of grim satisfaction in his voice. "I didn't think it was possible, but they're actually panicking." Markus's eyes glinted with cold resolve. "The Krath'vok don't know how to fight chaos. It's not in their nature." The battlefield had transformed. What began as a calculated assault had devolved into a frenzied dance of fire and fury, the coalition fleet pressing its advantage with relentless force. The void itself seemed to pulse with the echoes of destruction, the sharp tang of ionized particles searing the senses. But even as the swarm reeled, Markus knew the fight wasn't over. "They're adapting," he said, his tone a razor's edge. "This won't hold them forever." Voss glanced at him, his brow furrowed. "Then what's the next move?" Markus's gaze darkened. "We take their eyes." Deep within the Aegis Valor, the final phase of Markus's plan was set into motion. Technicians worked with frantic precision, their hands darting over consoles as they prepared the payload. The ship's experimental weapon, a device codenamed Oblivion, hummed faintly as it powered up. "This is untested," one of the engineers murmured, his voice trembling. "We don't know what kind of blowback we'll get." Markus stepped into the chamber, his presence a steel weight that steadied the air. "We're not testing it, we're using it." The engineer hesitated but nodded, his hands moving faster as he adjusted the final parameters. The weapon's core pulsed with a pale, eerie light, its energy building to a crescendo that thrummed in the marrow. Markus turned to Voss, who had followed him into the chamber. "Once this fires, we'll have seconds to get clear. Make sure the fleet is ready to retreat on my command." Voss studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "Understood." Markus faced the weapon, his jaw tightening. The Oblivion device wasn't just a weapon, it was a gamble, a leap into the unknown. But in war, the only certainty was the cost of hesitation. "Fire it," he ordered. The chamber shook as the weapon discharged, its energy rippling outward in an invisible wave. The Krath'vok ships closest to the epicenter convulsed violently, their organic hulls fracturing as the hive-mind's link faltered. The wave spread, enveloping the battlefield in a disorienting silence that felt almost alive. On the bridge, Markus watched as the swarm faltered. Their movements slowed, their precision unraveling into chaos. For the first time, the Krath'vok were blind. "Now," Markus said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Pull the fleet back. Let them choke on their confusion." The coalition fleet began its retreat, their ships slipping away like shadows into the void. The Krath'vok remained behind, their fractured ships adrift, their once unstoppable advance brought to a halt. As the Aegis Valor disappeared into the darkness, Markus stood at the command console, his expression unreadable. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Somewhere in the silence of space, the swarm would adapt. They always did, but so would humanity. Markus's voice broke the quiet, his words as cold and sharp as the stars outside. "Let them learn. We'll always be one step ahead." The Aegis Valor drifted through the dark expanse, its hull still gleaming faintly from the lingering heat of battle. The fleet was silent, each ship cloaked in the heavy quiet of recovery. Yet within the bridge of the flagship, tension thrummed like a taut wire. Markus Hale stood at the command console, his gray eyes fixed on the holographic display of the Krath'vok forces, now a fragmented patchwork of ships left disoriented in their wake. "They're blind for now," Voss said, his voice steadier than the subtle fidgeting of his fingers against his belt. "But they won't stay that way for long." "They never do," Markus replied, his tone clipped. He adjusted the display, zooming in on the remnants of the swarm. The once fluid hive mind now moved in sporadic bursts, its fractured coordination painfully visible. But to Markus, it wasn't enough. Blindness was temporary. He needed something permanent. Voss crossed his arms, leaning slightly toward the console. "So what's the plan now? Keep hitting them and hope they shatter completely?" "No. Markus said, his voice like steel dragged against stone. Hope doesn't win wars. We force them to break. He turned away from the display, his boots echoing faintly as he paced toward the center of the bridge. The room smelled faintly metallic, the tang of overworked circuits still lingering in the cool air. The crew moved efficiently around him, their expressions tense but focused, their faith in their commander evident in every movement. Markus's thoughts churned as he reached for a comms panel. Get me engineering. The voice of Chief Engineer Cade Vosser crackled through the speakers. This better be good, Commander. My team's barely holding together what's left of your experimental brilliance. Markus didn't flinch at the thinly veiled irritation. How long until we can recalibrate the Oblivion device for localized strikes? There was a pause, followed by a faint clatter of tools. Localized? You want to scale that monster down? You're asking for precision on a weapon designed to destabilize entire battlefields. I'm not asking, Markus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I need it operational in 3 hours. Vosser exhaled audibly, a sound that carried more than frustration. It carried the weight of someone who knew the stakes. Fine. But if it blows us all to hell, I'm telling everyone it was your idea. Markus cut the channel and turned back to Voss. We're going after their relay ships. Voss blinked, his brow furrowing. The relay ships? They're barely armed. What's the point? They're not just relay ships, Markus said, pointing to the map. They're the nodes of their hive-mind. Every signal, every strategy, it's all routed through them. Take those out and we cripple their ability to adapt. Voss's eyes widened slightly as the realization sank in. You think that'll be enough to break them? It'll do more than break them, Markus said. It'll make them desperate. Voss hesitated, his hand brushing the edge of the console as he leaned closer. And desperate enemies are the most dangerous. Exactly, Markus replied. They'll stop thinking like a hive and start acting like individuals. They won't just be weaker, they'll be vulnerable. The lieutenant studied his commander's expression, searching for cracks in the unrelenting determination that Markus wore like armor. He found none. Finally, he nodded. I'll prep the strike teams. Markus's voice was low as he added, This isn't just about firepower, Voss. We hit them fast, precise, and with just enough chaos to make them question every move they make. They'll adapt, but not fast enough. Hours later, the fleet regrouped in the shadow of a massive asteroid field. The cold expanse stretched endlessly before them, the jagged rocks glinting faintly as they rotated in eerie silence. The field was treacherous, its dense clusters of debris capable of shredding a ship to ribbons, but it was also the perfect staging ground for an ambush. Markus stood at the observation deck, his hands clasped tightly behind his back as he watched the fleet settle into position. The asteroid field provided cover, masking their movements from the Krath'vok's sensors. The enemy was already moving, their disoriented ships converging near the remaining relay nodes. They thought they were regrouping in safety. They were wrong. Strike teams are in position, Voss reported as he approached. The drones are synced with the targeting array. We can move on your command. Markus nodded, his gaze never leaving the asteroid field. Tell them to hold until we confirm their patterns. We don't engage until we know exactly how they'll react. Voss hesitated, then inclined his head. Understood. Minutes stretched into a tense stillness, the bridge filled only with the soft murmur of tactical updates. Markus stood like a statue, his every sense attuned to the subtle shifts in the battlefield. The Krath'vok's ships moved with a disjointed rhythm, their fractured coordination forcing them into slower, more deliberate formations. Finally, Markus straightened, his sharp gaze locking onto the display. Now. The strike teams moved with ruthless efficiency. From the cover of the asteroid field, squadrons of fast attack craft surged forward, their engines leaving trails of faint light as they weaved through the debris. The relay ships, massive but lightly armored, reacted sluggishly, their defensive turrets firing sporadically as the attack began. The first relay ship buckled under the assault, its organic hull rupturing in a violent burst of light and debris. The destruction rippled through the Krath'vok's forces, their movements faltering further as the hive-mind struggled to compensate. "They're pulling back," Voss said, his voice tight with restrained urgency. "They're trying to protect the remaining nodes." Markus's jaw tightened. "Don't let them. Push harder." The coalition forces pressed the attack, their precision strikes carving through the swarm's disjointed defenses. Each relay ship destroyed sent another shockwave through the hive-mind, the once fluid movements of the Krath'vok now reduced to chaotic flailing. But as the battle unfolded, Markus's sharp instincts caught something, an undercurrent of calculation hidden beneath the swarm's disarray. He leaned closer to the display, his eyes narrowing as he traced their movements. "They're baiting us," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the noise. "Pull back the strike teams. Now." Voss's head snapped toward him, confusion flashing across his face. "Pull back? We've got them." "Now," Markus barked, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. Voss relayed the order, and the strike teams disengaged, their ships retreating into the safety of the asteroid field. Seconds later, a massive energy surge rippled through the battlefield, originating from the remaining relay ships. The surge destabilized the area, sending debris spiraling violently and forcing the coalition fleet to recalibrate their positions. Markus's expression was grim as he watched. "They're learning faster than I expected." Voss's jaw clenched. "So what do we do now?" Markus turned to him, his gaze sharp as a blade. "We make them think they've won." The lieutenant blinked, his brow furrowing. "You're not serious." "They're expecting us to push harder to press the advantage," Markus said. "Instead, we retreat. Let them regroup. Let them think they've adapted." Voss's expression was tight, his skepticism clear, but he nodded. "And then?" Markus's gray eyes glinted with cold resolve. "And then we show them what real chaos looks like." The Aegis Valor withdrew with the rest of the fleet, disappearing into the asteroid field's shifting shadows. The swarm, disoriented but not broken, began to regroup around their remaining relay ships, their movements slow but deliberate. Markus watched as the tactical display shifted, his mind already racing ahead. The Krath'vok thought they had survived humanity's chaos. They had no idea what was coming next. The Aegis Valor floated on the edge of darkness, its silhouette a sharp, defiant shadow against the distant dying embers of the battlefield. Inside the bridge, the atmosphere was razor-sharp, the quiet humming with unspoken tension. Every officer was fixed on Markus Hale, whose unyielding gaze rested on the holographic display before him. The Krath'vok ships were regrouping, their fractured hive-mind slowly knitting itself back together around the last relay nodes. "Are they taking the bait?" Voss asked, his voice low but taut. Markus's lips pressed into a thin line. He studied the enemy movements, watching as the swarm consolidated into a tighter formation around the remaining nodes. The hive-mind wasn't just reacting, it was evolving, turning its defensive maneuver into a calculated trap. "They're not just taking it," Markus said. "They're setting one of their own." Voss leaned closer, the flicker of frustration in his eyes tempered by grim determination. "So what's the play?" Markus straightened, his voice calm but laced with iron. "We finish this. Every move, every counter, they've learned from us. But there's one thing they still don't understand." "And what's that?" Voss asked, his tone wary. Markus's gray eyes gleamed with something primal. "That humans don't just survive chaos, we thrive in it." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, electrifying the room. The crew shifted, their tension transforming into a collective resolve. Markus's confidence was contagious, a wildfire spreading through every soul aboard the ship. "Activate the final protocols," Markus ordered, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Deploy the decoy drones at full saturation. I want them seeing ghosts in every shadow." The tactical officer's fingers flew across the console, and moments later, the void outside came alive with movement. Swarms of drones spilled into the darkness, their sleek forms darting erratically as they projected false signatures. The Krath'vok fleet reacted instantly, their ships breaking formation to chase the phantom targets. "They're scattering," Voss said, a hint of awe creeping into his voice. "But they'll regroup as soon as they realize." "They won't have time," Markus replied. "Prepare the Oblivion device for targeted strikes. Focus on the relay ships. We don't just want to blind them, we want to cut their mind in half." The bridge pulsed with controlled chaos as the crew executed the orders. The air carried the faint metallic tang of recycled oxygen, the sound of hurried footsteps and whispered commands blending into a symphony of anticipation. Markus remained a steady presence, his mind calculating every possibility, every risk. As the Oblivion device powered up, the room dimmed slightly, the core's pale light casting ghostly shadows across the walls. Voss stepped closer to Markus, his voice quieter now. "And when this works? What happens next?" Markus's gaze didn't waver. "Then they learn what fear really is." The device fired. A wave of energy rippled through the void, a silent scream that rippled like a storm against the Krath'vok fleet. The first relay ship convulsed, its organic hull rupturing as the hive-mind's connection faltered. The second followed, its movements jerking erratically before it was engulfed in a blinding explosion. "They're losing cohesion," a tactical officer reported, his voice vibrating with a mix of shock and exhilaration. "Their movements, they're breaking apart." Markus watched as the hive-mind unraveled, its once fluid coordination dissolving into chaos. The Krath'vok ships flailed, their movements disjointed as the collective intelligence that had guided them fractured into isolated fragments. "They're vulnerable," Voss said, his tone rising with urgency. "We can finish them." "Not yet," Markus replied, his voice a cold blade. "Let them choke on their own confusion." The tactical display showed the swarm's ships turning on each other, their fractured signals creating a cascade of errors. Ships collided, weapons misfired, and the once unstoppable tide of destruction collapsed into disarray. But Markus's expression remained hard, unrelenting. He knew better than to celebrate. The Krath'vok weren't defeated yet. "They're adapting again," he said, his voice cutting through the momentary triumph. "They'll try to rebuild, to reassert control, and when they do..." A sudden alarm pierced the air, cutting him off. The display shifted, highlighting a new surge of energy emanating from the remaining nodes. The fractured swarm wasn't retreating, it was retaliating. "They're amplifying their signals," Voss said, his voice tight. "They're using the disruption against us." Markus's jaw clenched. "Of course they are. That's what they do." The bridge fell silent as everyone turned to him, waiting for the next move. Markus's mind raced, threading together the threads of strategy he had woven throughout the battle. The Krath'vok were learning, but they weren't the only ones. "Redirect the drones," Markus ordered. "Converge them on the nodes. Overload their sensors." "And us?" Voss asked, his tone a careful balance of skepticism and trust. Markus's gray eyes glinted with a spark of defiance. "We go straight for the heart." The Aegis Valor surged forward, its sleek form slicing through the chaos as it headed directly for the center of the swarm. The ship's weapons blazed, carving a path through the fractured Krath'vok ships as the drones swarmed the relay nodes, their relentless assault overwhelming the enemy's systems. The bridge trembled as the ship absorbed glancing blows, the faint smell of heated metal seeping into the air. Markus stood firm, his voice a steady anchor amid the storm. "Keep firing. Don't let up." The final relay node loomed ahead, its organic structure pulsing with an unnatural light. Markus's eyes narrowed as he gave the final order. "Target the core. Full power." The ship's main cannon roared, unleashing a concentrated beam of energy that pierced the relay node. The structure convulsed, its light flickering wildly before it collapsed in a brilliant explosion. The shockwave rippled through the battlefield, and the swarm's remaining ships stilled, their movements faltering as the hive-mind shattered completely. For a moment the void was silent. The once unstoppable Krath'vok, reduced to fragments of their former power. The crew erupted in cheers, their relief palpable. But Markus remained still, his gaze fixed on the display. He wasn't celebrating. He was waiting. "They're done," Voss said, his voice laced with disbelief. "We actually broke them." Markus's expression didn't change. "For now." Voss frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean?" Markus's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of something far greater. Fear isn't just about survival. It's about control. We've shown them chaos, but they'll learn from it. They'll find a way to turn it back on us. Voss hesitated, his brow furrowing. "So what now?" Markus turned to him, his gray eyes colder than the void. "Now we remind them why humanity survives. We don't just adapt. We redefine the rules." The bridge fell silent again, the weight of his words sinking into every soul aboard the ship. Markus turned back to the display, his gaze fixed on the remnants of the battlefield. Somewhere in the darkness, the Krath'vok would regroup, but so would humanity. As the Aegis Valor turned back toward the fleet, Markus's voice broke the silence one last time, a quiet, defiant declaration that sent chills through everyone who heard it. "They thought they knew fear," he said, his tone sharp as steel. "Now they know us.